Good afternoon. On behalf of Ed Steele, Chairman and CEO of EAS Consulting Group, I would like to welcome you to the fifth in our five-part webinar series on GMP Compliance and the Dietary Supplement Laboratory, presented by EAS Senior Director for Dietary Supplement and Tobacco Services, Dr. Tara Lynn Couch. Today's topic, how to select and qualify a contract laboratory. EAS specializes in FDA regulatory matters with a prime focus of assisting domestic and foreign food, pharmaceutical, dietary supplement, medical device, cosmetic, and tobacco firms comply with applicable laws and regulations. EAS is staffed with former FDA and compliance and inspection officials and industry executives and is assisted by an extensive network of consultants with many years of FDA and industry experience. Today's webinar is presented by Dr. Tara Lynn Couch. Dr. Couch is a diverse laboratory and regulatory experience in academic, field, contract, and manufacturing environments. She is a sought-after expert on issues pertaining to quality control in both pharmaceutical and dietary supplement manufacturing facilities, including the establishment of specifications and the development of well-organized, sophisticated laboratories. Dr. Couch joined EAS as an independent consultant in 2012 and became an independent advisor for dietary supplements in 2015 and recently joined the company full-time as a senior director. Over the years, she has assisted numerous dietary supplement companies with the development, improvement, and implementation of strong quality systems that are scientifically sound, efficient, practical, and compliant with all FDA regulations. As a reminder, during the webinar, you may ask any questions of Tara by typing them into the questions box. And with that, I will say thank you again for joining EAS, and I'll turn the presentation over to Tara.
Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. So thank you for participating in our fifth of the series, and thanks for that nice introduction, Amy. So today we're going to talk about qualification of a contract laboratory, how to select and qualify a contract laboratory. So we're going to generally talk about 5 different areas. So one would be the regulatory requirements of the of this process, contract laboratory use criteria, how to select the contract laboratory, how to qualify that contract laboratory, and then how to challenge that laboratory. So we first begin with the regulations. So if you've been part of this series, we of course are focusing on dietary supplements for 21 CFR 111, which are the current good manufacturing practices in manufacturing, packaging, labeling, or holding operations for quality of a dietary supplement is defined in these regulations as demonstrating specifications that cover 5 categories of identity, purity, strength, composition, and the limits of potential contamination. So this is all accomplished through testing using a quality control laboratory. So the quality control laboratory provides the analytical and or microbiological testing, also physical testing of all dietary and non-dietary ingredients in process samples, finished products, and even environmental samples. The laboratory can also provide other services such as analytical methods development, verification, microbiological preservative effectiveness testing, preparatory testing. If the laboratory has capability with stability chambers, they can also have the storage of your stability chambers and testing of those samples that you're using. And this laboratory can be either in-house, an internal laboratory, or an external contract laboratory. So of course today we're going to focus on the contract laboratory, but all of these same requirements basically fall underneath the internal laboratory as well. So in the regulation, subpart J is the laboratory operations section, actually one of the smaller sections of the regulation, which is sort of sad. But at the same time, in that regulation, there are basically 5 sections that dictate what requirements pertain to the laboratory. So we're going to kind of break them into those different sections. So we have written procedures that are dictated in 111.303, laboratory facilities dictated in 111.310, laboratory control processes, which are in 111.315, scientifically valid test methods, which are in 111.320, and then documentation of everything in 111.325. So as I said, subpart J is the one that specifically pertains to laboratory operate. However, all of these others indicated in red also reference testing and laboratory operations. So even though J is the one that particularly talks about laboratory operations, all of these others shown in the red highlight here also pertain to the laboratory operations. And then if we talk about what else is applicable, we also bring in subpart B, which is personnel, because of course laboratory has personnel, and we bring in subpart O for product complaints, because the laboratory will be involved in some of those investigations, and of course records and record keeping. The laboratory generates lots and lots of data, so we have to have appropriate maintenance of the records and record keeping done in the laboratory. So the contract laboratory is that external third-party laboratory that conducts the testing for an own label distributor, which is basically the brand owner, a virtual company that uses contractors to do all the production of the dietary supplements. So that can mean a contract manufacturer to manufacture the product, a co-packer to do the packaging of the product, a contract laboratory to do the testing, and even someone else to do distribution. So everything can be contracted out. It could also be a dietary supplement manufacturer, so a contract manufacturer themselves that need some additional resources from a contract laboratory, or the manufacturer of the product itself. So it can be either a contract manufacturer or an own label contract manufacturer. Regardless of who does all this work, whoever contracts out with the laboratory is responsible for ensuring that the laboratory complies with the GMPs. A product that is absolutely okay from a finished product testing perspective is still considered adulterated if it was not manufactured underneath the 21 CFR 111 requirements. So the FDA has explicitly numerous warning letters that have been issued over the last 6 years, and I'm just not going to read this in its entirety, but you can see in the red highlight, it dictates that even though we may contract out various manufacturing operations, we cannot also contract out the ultimate responsibility to ensure that the dietary supplement product that is placed into commerce is not adulterated for failure to comply with these GMP requirements. The FDA goes on to say that a firm that does this, that contracts out operations, also must have a quality system to ensure the quality of the dietary supplement. Some other warning letter observations is that the quality control personnel must ensure the quality of the dietary supplement. So this brings into play 21 CFR 111-105, which we're going to talk about for personnel. Quality control personnel must review and approve for release any product that's going to be placed onto the market for the consumer. So the contract laboratory must therefore be very carefully chosen and critically evaluated. So we're going to kind of break this down into 4 sections. So the scientific expertise of the laboratory, the GMP compliance of the laboratory, the quality systems that the laboratory has, and how this laboratory is compatible with the own label distributor, manufacturer, or contract manufacturer. So typically the whole purpose of using a contract laboratory is to get the scientific expertise that is not available in-house. So this includes personnel. So depending on the operations that the laboratory does, they will have chemists and/or microbiologists of varying education levels. There'll also be people with extensive laboratory experience, so they understand the safe use of chemicals, bacteria, yeast, and molds if they're also doing microbiological testing, and the knowledge of laboratory processes themselves. And there may also be some particular subject matter experts or SMEs that have specialized experience in a type of analytical and/or microbiological technique. In addition to the scientific expertise of personnel, there will also be testing methodologies that a laboratory generally tends to specialize in. So it is often the case that there's multiple types of analytical techniques that can be used to perform a particular test. And certain laboratories will specialize in one of those types of techniques. So we have to make sure that we're selecting the appropriate test method for the result that we're looking for. It's appropriate for the specification that's been given. So this could be a qualitative or a quantitative test, and all test methods have to be demonstrated to be scientifically valid, If you were with us a couple weeks ago, we had a webinar on what is a scientifically valid test method, so you can reference that. But the FDA described that as accurate, precise, specific for its intended use, and consistently doing what it's intended to do, which we often refer to as ruggedness. So as an example of the variety of different techniques that can be used, if we look at folic acid, for example, that's a dietary ingredient, so we could test that as a raw material, as a finished dietary supplement, or as a finished dietary supplement, or even potentially an in-process sample. And there's multiple ways to do that. So we can do that by a wet chemical titration, we can do that by a microbiological assay, we can also use liquid chromatography, or an ELISA, an enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. All of these can be done in either a qualitative or quantitative type of capacity, but there are benefits and weaknesses to each one of these methods. So the wet chemical analysis is basically an acid-based titration. Folic acid is an acid, so we do an acid-based titration. The problem with doing a wet chemical titration is this won't be specific if other acids are also present in the matrix. So this would therefore not be specific and not meet our criteria of being a scientifically valid test method. Microbiological methods have good specificity, so we can overcome that, but they tend to be less precise. So depending on the laboratory and the test and the specifics of the test method, typically the precision is somewhere around plus or minus 15 to 20%. HPLC, or high performance liquid chromatography, has excellent precision and excellent specificity, but it's a more sophisticated technique and it requires appropriate instrumentation to do that, the HPLC. ELISA also has good precision. The problem with ELISA is it is very subject to cross-contamination, so you have to have specifically trained personnel in order to do this. And in most laboratories, we see ELISA done by the microbiological staff because they are excellent in preventing cross-contamination. In addition to personnel and test methods, we'll have equipment and instrumentation expertise at different laboratories. So in a lot of cases, there's a variety of different instrumentation that can be used to perform a test method. Oftentimes, this is in the detection system, but this can be even different types of equipment itself. So the type of equipment that's chosen has to be appropriate for the sample. So as an example, we can determine arsenic using ICP, which is the best method to do this. It can also be done by AA, atomic absorption. ICP itself has two different types of detection systems. We can use an AES, an atomic emission spectrometer, sometimes called an optical emission spectrometer, or a mass spectrometer. So these are two different options. So using the mass spec will decrease our detection limits, at least in order to magnitude, potentially more than that. And this is essential if we're doing trace analysis. The caveat is that an ICP-MS system is about twice the cost of an AES system, so about $250,000 compared to about $125,000. Both very expensive, but the mass spec is obviously more expensive. In terms of GMP compliance, of course, we have 21 CFR 111 compliance, which is our GMP regulations for dietary supplement. But there's also good laboratory practices that are expected to be maintained in a laboratory. This is not to get confused with good for clinical laboratories for GLPs, which are underneath a different 21 CFR. These were introduced back in the United States way back in 1978. And this is a set of principles that provides a framework for laboratories to ensure integrity of the data. So there's a variety of different factors here. So all of your laboratories, whether they're GMP compliant or not, should be following good laboratory practice. In addition to that, we have good documentation practices, referred to as GDPs. So these are the standard by which documents and records are created and maintained, again, to ensure integrity of the data that's being generated. So I was always taught when I went into good laboratory practices and good documentation practices that there are 5 caveats. They must be the 5 C's. Clear, concise, correct, complete, and compliant is the 5th one that you would put here. In addition to 21 CFR 111, if a laboratory is using electronic systems, we would also have to comply with 21 CFR 11, which is electronic records, electronic signatures. So there are other types of GMP compliances that the laboratory must maintain. In addition to these GMP, GLP, and GDP, all of our favorite acronyms for the laboratory, in addition to those, the laboratory must have appropriate quality systems. Now, some of those are kind of covered underneath these GMP, GLPs, and GDPs, but we have to have a system to ensure that any investigations that are conducted in the laboratory are thorough, timely, unbiased, well documented, and scientifically sound. So those are specifically called out in the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research Guidance for Industry on out-of-specification test results, which is one of the better guidance for industries that came out in October of 2006. And OOS investigations are typically the most critical or most common investigations that are undertaken in a contract laboratory, but there are also other types of investigations that would take place in the laboratory. This includes an investigation for procedural or process deviations, also for corrective and preventative actions, so there should be a CAPA program in place. Out of specifications, as we just mentioned, but this also includes out of trend, especially if we're doing stability data at that site, and aberrant test results. So they may not necessarily be out of specification, but not as anticipated. So we have to have an organized documentation system that has change control built into that. So that means we're controlling every revision and we know what's changed from one revision to another. The contract laboratory also has to be compatible with either the own label distributor, the manufacturer, or the contract manufacturer. This company is going to be a partner of yours that's responsible for giving you the data to allow you to release product. So you have to have similar types of mantras and missions and policies for personnel. That usually makes it work the best. And you have to make sure that they have the services that you're looking for. So you should request a catalog or look online. Make sure they have whatever type of testing that you need. So as we talked about in the beginning, some laboratories will specialize in environmental testing for air, water, and even contact services. Method development, method validation. Remember, we have to demonstrate that our test methods are scientifically valid. So laboratories will have that expertise. And then if the facility has stability chambers, then we would have stability storage requirements as well. So how do we go about picking this laboratory that has all these things that we need? Where do you find them? So just some easy places to look. Look at trade organizations within the dietary supplement space and then the nutritional space. So the Natural Products Association has lists of just different laboratories. The CRN, Council for Responsible Nutrition, also has some, APA, and the NSF. They will all reference some laboratories. Most contract laboratories will be at a lot of the big conferences and exhibitions, so like Supply Side, Natural Product Expo, Rocky Mountain Dietary Supplement Forum, just to name a few. There'll also be laboratories that are cited in scientific publications or even from your raw material supplier. So they'll have the testing that they're using from a contract laboratory, and of course, just reputation, just asking around. You can find a contract laboratory. So once you've got a name, you need to do some background investigation on the laboratory. Remember, they're going to be a partner, so you want to be very critical of the laboratory. So look at their regulatory history. So conduct simple searches on government websites like the FDA website, EPA website, OSHA, FTC, even state and local authorities. All of those are available online, so you can very quickly do an evaluation to see if they've been in trouble with any federal agencies. Also look to the certifications that the laboratory may have. So this could be from the DEA if they're handling controlled substances, or from the USDA, especially if they're handling foods. There are other types of certifications that are also offered that a lot of laboratories seek. So ISO 17025 is really popular right now, but bearing in mind that that doesn't mean that they're GMP compliant. That just means that they've done an ISO 17025 certification, and those are specific for a competency in a test or a particular type of analysis or a typical type of operation. So it's not comprehensive for the entire lab. For microbiological testing, there's ISO 7218, which applies to that area. NELAP is also one for environmental laboratories. A lot of your environmental laboratories will use that. This could come into play when we're talking about doing pesticide testing, even residual solvent or heavy metal testing. A lot of those laboratories will have NELAP certification. The AOAC also has a certification process, and so does the United States Pharmacopoeia. So you also need to be concerned about the logistics. So any initial communication that you have with the laboratory should ascertain that the laboratory is capable of handling the sample volumes that you need and the turnaround times that you need. So typically, standard TAT is 10 business days, but this can be rushed and broken up in half to about 5 days. Costs vary greatly depending on the type of test that's being done. An analytical test is typically around $250, where a microbiological test is about $50. But again, this is going to vary greatly depending on the type of test that's being done. If you do want to double that cost and do that in a rush period, that's going to double the cost. Some laboratories that specialize in certain tests have actually brought down that standard 10-day TAT significantly. So if you're looking at a laboratory that specializes in heavy metal testing, for example, you also need to figure out who the correspondence is going to be with, so set up who your contact person is at the contract laboratory and who the contact person is at your facility, who at the OLD, who at the dietary supplement manufacturer, who at the CME is going to be that contact person. You don't want to have 10 people talking to the laboratory. You really want to isolate that to 1 or 2 people. You also need to figure out the sample submission requirements. So how do you ship a sample to them? What kind of paperwork do you need to fill out? Is it actual hard copy paperwork, or is it something that's done electronically? And then for test results, how do you deliver those test results, and how are those test results reported? All those things are critical logistics that need to be worked out with the laboratory. You should also set up a couple different types of agreements with the laboratory. So a CDA, or a confidentiality disclosure agreement, outlines the confidentiality requirements. So bear in mind that the laboratory is doing a lot of work for other people besides yourself. So you want to make sure that the laboratory is capable of making sure that your information is held private, just like you would want them to do, just like they'll do for other people. It's also a good idea to have a quality agreement with your contract laboratory. These have come into favor with the contract manufacturers as well, and these have been used for many, many years in the pharmaceutical space. But this lays out who's responsible for what in terms of quality. And this is really beneficial, especially when we're talking about OOS investigations. It aligns who's going to be responsible for what these are going to be undertaken. You don't want to do this when you have your first OOS investigation. It's better to set up these criteria ahead of time. It'll also establish you having accessibility to raw data. So if you're being audited by an inspector, you may have to produce that data and do that pretty quickly. So you want to make sure you've worked out those details before you are undergoing an inspection. And then, of course, also some of the logistics about test report format. So make sure you're using the appropriate units. The C of A has all the information that you need on it in terms of the test method, quantitation limits and detection limits, the nomenclature for what those things are that are going to be issued on the C of A. All of those details can be worked out in a quality agreement. And then we need to officially qualify the laboratory. So we need to have a standard operation procedure in place that will govern this process. And what this process typically includes is some sort of a contract laboratory questionnaire, which is often referred to as the paper audit. And then you have the on-site audit that follows up with that to actually go into the facility and audit the facility and make sure everything that they said on the paper audit is consistent. And then to challenge that laboratory with testing. And then you have to periodically requalify. So this could be done on an annual basis or a biennial basis, depending on the qualification requirements and what's happened with the laboratory. So we'll kind of look through each one of these. So the questionnaire is a self-assessment that's completed by the laboratory to document all of their background information and compliance with all the applicable regulations. This paper audit is used to do an initial risk assessment to evaluate the laboratory as either high, medium, or low risk. And that will help you prioritize when to audit that lab and how frequently to audit that lab. So this questionnaire is quite extensive. I think the template that I have is about 20 pages long for a questionnaire, so it's very extensive. It'll include questions about the regulatory and those certifications that they may have, information about the laboratory structure itself, so this will include an org chart, key personnel and their education and experience, so usually you would receive biographies of those people, what their basic quality system is in terms of compliance with 21 CFR 111. So this will be their written procedures, so usually an SOP and table of contents, a list of table of contents of test methods, because usually general SOPs are held in a slightly different documentation system than test methods. The laboratory has to be safe. You have to have appropriate chemical hygiene program in the laboratory. They are working with dangerous chemicals in a lot of cases, or microbiological hazards, so you have to make sure they have the appropriate chemical hygiene program. I actually was in a laboratory where I was very uncomfortable with the safety of the laboratory, and I kid you not, the laboratory blew up like 3 weeks after I audited the laboratory. I mean, literally blew up. So you need to have laboratory facility information too, their location, how many years of operation they've been, who's the owner, the size of the facility, hours of operation, the number of personnel that we have. Also an equipment or instrumentation list. So remember, this is part of their scientific expertise that we're trying to understand. And how do they manage all of their equipment? So the qualification of the equipment, the calibration of the equipment, and the maintenance of that equipment. Those are all regulatory requirements. And then the laboratory control processes. So look at some of their key systems. So obviously personnel training, that's one of the reasons you go there, is for their scientific expertise of personnel. Equipment and instrument controls. Sample tracking is critical in a laboratory. Some of the bigger laboratories will receive thousands of samples a day, so they need to have a very detailed those samples that they're receiving. How do they manage their standards? So everything traces back to their standards, their reference materials. So they need to have a good management system for those standards and a qualification of those standards. How do they characterize those? It's very important. How do they prepare their media and their chemical preparation? So this would be their working standards and even their reagents and mobile phases. So how do they do all that? How do they control all of that? And data review, not date review, data review. So how do they review all of that data and make sure that that data has integrity? And then of course we have records that we have to maintain, lots of them. So we have to make sure that they're managing those appropriately. So all of this will be done in some sort of documentation system. And so we have to be following those good documentation practices, and those have to be going through change control, so we always know what revision we're working with and what change from one version to another. Also, the quality system in general, so we already talked about investigating deviations and out of specifications, and of course corrective and preventative actions. Now these will be critical when you do an on-site audit. They should issue a CAPA for every observation that you issue to make sure that those things are being addressed appropriately. So once we've determined that we've done this questionnaire and assess the risk of the facility, we're going to go in and audit the laboratory in person. These are essential to verify the questionnaire information is accurate, and then those practices for GMP, GLP, GDP, and all those other policies and processes are actually being followed as they're documented. So these should be completed ideally prior to the performance of any testing, so that when we are able to give them the specification and get the results, we can actually release that and distribute that to the consumer, knowing that GMPs are being followed and our product is not adulterated. So the auditor that you send to do these on-site audits has to have the appropriate level of expertise to do an audit of the laboratory. A laboratory is a very different environment than a manufacturing facility, so you have to have somebody that has that level of expertise. If you don't have that available in-house, then you need to hire an appropriate subject matter expert to do that. So this could be someone that you have in your formulations group, or if you do have your own laboratory, some of that, or if you need to go out and get an outside consultant, then you can do that too. So again, the main purpose of this on-site audit is to ensure compliance with everything on the questionnaire and all parts of the 21 CFR 111 and any other statutory requirements that apply. So this again would be our 21 CFR 11 if we're using electronic records, electronic signatures, and there are also some other types of requirements that would come into play. So this on-site audit will evaluate the regulatory and audit history, the laboratory certifications. You'll walk through the facility. I always joke when, I always kind of giggle when I say walk through. This is an audit. So you're not just walking through and looking at stuff. You're critically evaluating all of their systems and asking pertinent questions. Looking at the scientific expertise of personnel, looking at their GMP compliance and their overall quality system. The audit also serves as the beginning of your business relationship between your soon-to-be partner. So it's really important that the outside auditor evaluate the facility in that capacity. And if the own label distributor, manufacturer, contract manufacturer can be present, I highly recommend that, because that is this initial part of the interaction between you and the laboratory. So you have an initial introductory meeting. Usually they're working lunches, so you can work right through lunch, and then there's a closeout meeting with a verbal summary of the audit findings that's presented at the end of the audit. So typically these audits should be a day and a half to allow for a full day of auditing, a little bit of follow-up the next day, and then a closeout meeting sometime just before lunch on the second day. The audit report should be thorough and detailed, summarizing all the observations that were noted. So this will be generated by the auditor. And the observations should be categorized. So at EAS, we categorize those as critical, major, or minor, depending on the severity of the FDA action that is expected to take place because of the observation. And then a list of the necessary corrective and preventative actions that could also be included. And also it recommends recommendations for improvements. So it depends on the nature of the audit, how you're doing the audit, but oftentimes these are very, very beneficial, especially if you're not available to be on site during the audit, because this tells you exactly what those CAPAs should be and to make sure that those are executed to use the laboratory. So once we've done all this, then we want to still challenge the laboratory via challenge testing. And this is a great tool that's underutilized in the industry to make sure that the laboratory is accurately, precisely, and specifically generating data consistently. It's also a tool to avoid dry labbing. Now, you would probably have some significant warning signs when you did the on-site audit to know that you would have some issues in this laboratory, but unfortunately, dry labbing or the falsification of testing results still happens in the industry. It's disgusting, but it still happens. A challenge testing can be done with or without the knowledge of the contract laboratory, and a good laboratory will not be offended if you're doing challenge testing. If the laboratory indicate to them that you want to do this and they say no, you can't do that, then you need to find a different contract laboratory, because a good laboratory will not at all be offended. I was in fact very proud when we found out we had a challenge sample in the laboratory, and of course we got the result that we expected to get. So there's a couple different types of challenge testing that can be undertaken. So there's InterLaboratory testing, you can use replicates, there's fortification samples, and there's blind testing. So InterLaboratory testing is exactly what it sounds like. It's taking a single sample and partitioning that and sending it to multiple laboratories and evaluating the results against one another. You have to be very careful about doing this to make sure that both laboratories, or all laboratories if you're using more than 2 laboratories, are using the same methodology. And then you evaluate the results within known method variability and see what's happening. Replicates are also very beneficial to send samples in replicates to a single laboratory. Preferably, this is done in at least groups of 3, because that will allow you to get an actual mean and standard deviation and make some assessments about the analysis that were performed. And then there's also the fortification sample. So taking a sample and fortifying a known amount of an analyte and being able to recover that. So this is an indirect evaluation of the accuracy of a test method. And then there's also blind testing, so to submit a variety of different samples to the laboratory and and see what results that they get. So these could be samples with known amounts or actually with none. So and see if they say we can't find any vitamin A in this sample. So is there something wrong? So that's exactly what you were intending in that particular sample. So these results can be evaluated both for accuracy and. So in conclusion, the contract laboratory is your partner. So make sure that the quality laboratory is qualified to be that partner. And you're using their test results to demonstrate identity, purity, strength, composition, and limits of contamination on your products. So it's critical that they are GMP compliant. So do your homework, evaluate the laboratory well, choose wisely with the laboratory, qualify the laboratory, and then challenge the results. So thank you for listening. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to address any of those.
Tara, our first question is, what steps are involved in the lab requalification?
So the laboratory, that's a good question. So the laboratory requalification should include issuance of the laboratory questionnaire again. So you don't necessarily need to make them fill out all 20 pages or so again, but have them update any information. So if they had some major personnel changes, you would want to know that. If they've built a new wing onto the laboratory, or they've closed part of their operation, they have a new major system that is in play that they didn't have before, you would want to know these things, because this would indicate to you whether you need to conduct another on-site audit. So on-site audits could also be part of the requalification. So depending on how you ranked the laboratory as high, medium, or low risk. So a high risk laboratory is certainly a laboratory that you would want to audit on an annual basis. You can also alter that high, medium, and low risk depending on the audit results themselves. So if you went in to do an on-site audit and the laboratory looks fabulous, you may put them down on a lower risk, and you wouldn't have to go on that questionnaire, because that may change your mind. If they had a major change in personnel or a major change of their facility, you'd want to go evaluate that again. Another thing that can impact that high, medium, and low risk to help you to decide what you need to do for that requalification is the results you've been getting. If you've been getting a lot of out of specification results, or communication with the laboratory has been very challenging, you may want to put them into a higher risk category and go back and visit that laboratory again. And then, of course, challenge testing should be roped in. So in lieu of having to go on site, if the laboratory is rating that as a medium or a low risk, you can use challenge testing and do that annually and make sure that you're doing some sort of challenging to the results and making sure that you get what you anticipate that you get. So all those things can be incorporated and should be built into that SOP that would dictate what your qualification requirements are and your requalification requirements.
Where can I find definitions for low, medium, and high-risk facilities?
There is no definition. So that's a definition that you'll create. So as you were just saying, based on what's important to you. So some of the things that you can think about is, the types of products that you're having them test. If the matrices that you're having them test are very complex, that could be a high-risk laboratory just because of the nature of the ingredients and the products that you're having them test, if they're very difficult. If they're things that are prone to cross-contamination, such as botanical materials that are organic, right? They tend to carry a very high microload. So if those are the types of samples that you're having them test, you might qualify them as high risk. If when you do your homework and evaluate the laboratory and seeing that the laboratory's received a Fortification or a warning letter, certainly they would be put into a high-risk category. If, like I said, you're seeing issues with OOS results or having challenges there, you may want to put them into a higher risk category as well. And of course, the audit is going to give you all kinds of information about what you think about the laboratory. So usually that's one of the deciding factors for whether you would consider a laboratory a low, medium, or high risk. So I've had some clients that will actually define that in a procedure that if they had any critical observations during the on-site audit report, they would immediately put them into a high risk and not use that laboratory until all those CAPAs had been addressed. So you can define that in your procedure, and that's how that should be handled.
Is it possible to ask if the lab has procedures and schedules for instrument and equipment maintenance and calibration? And if so, how can they substantiate this?
Absolutely. So they are required to have those things in accordance to 111.27 of the regulation, which is in subpart D, equipment and utensils. So they must have a qualification program, a calibration program, and a maintenance program on all of their equipment. So this is actually something that I see is usually weak for facilities that are ISO 17025 accredited, but not necessarily GMP accredited. They tend to be weak on the instrument side, is what I've tended to see. So certainly you should ask them for that. So that would be one thing in your questionnaire. You would ask for how they qualify their equipment and what the SOP, they should have several SOPs that discuss that process of the qualification and of the calibration. And usually each piece of equipment or type of equipment will have a separate SOP that dictates what's required and what the frequency of that is. So like quarterly, we do this. So all those things would be dictated in those procedures. So those should be something that you look at in the questionnaire and then follow up on the on-site audit.
If the lab is ISO certified, can we bypass an on-site audit if we incorporate this statement on our internal SOPs?
Absolutely not. So ISO certification is not GMP compliance. I have seen many labs that are ISO certified, have some sort of 17025 certification, and they're terrible. So you certainly want to look at all laboratories. And remember, ISO 17025 is not an entire laboratory. It's specific to a test method or operation. So it'll dictate that they can run, I don't know, vitamin C, for example, or they can operate a balance. So it's not an entire system. And there are things in GMPs that are not covered in ISO. OOS investigation would be one of those. So they do have to have a quality manual, but it's not near the level of detail that you would expect in a GMP environment. So remember I showed that slide that said we have subpart J we have to comply with, but then pretty much everything else except LMM. And so there are all these requirements that have to be applicable to the laboratory. Not all those are covered in the 17025.
Okay, that concludes our questions for today. Thanks everyone for participating with us. And Tara, thank you again for all 5 parts of your Dietary Supplements GMP Compliance Laboratory webinar series. We recorded today's webinar, so we should have it posted on the EAS website in the next couple days. And thanks everyone again for participating. Have a great day.
Thank you.